Awesome Mayo here with a fancy soundtrack. In today's WBE lesson, destroy enemies with friendship. A Chinese emperor once called his rivals his fellow friends. A general in his army said, "Why do you call them our friends? They are our enemies and we should destroy them." The emperor replied, "When I turn an enemy into a friend, have I not destroyed an enemy?" Ah, interesting, right? The single most effective way to destroy an enemy is to turn them into a friend. Do not pick or invite unnecessary battles. Even if they seem or actually are easily winnable, the frequency and compounding friction can be devastating. And given how avoidable these costs are, continuing needless combat is a form of self-sabotage. Do not let your ego get in the way of progress. Non-supporters can quickly become enthusiastic supporters when your agenda includes advancement of theirs. Do not silence critics, help them amplify a different message. Here are two examples. First, a not ideal example. This is New York City around 1910. The subway was just coming around and construction workers were digging, and at about 20 feet below the street level, the workers found something shocking, something amazing, something astonishing, and something so unbelievable that there were some people who thought that aliens had put this thing there, that this thing that they found was put there by some supernatural force. So what was it that they found? What the men who were digging to build the subway found was a subway. Yes, an already existing subway that almost nobody seemed to know anything about. And it wasn't just any subway, but they could tell that at one time this was a really nice subway. Although it was old and abandoned long ago, they could tell that at one time this subway was really nice. In its day, the subway had a beautiful waiting room, a grandfather clock, pretty chandeliers, a fancy piano. It even had a fountain that used to be stocked with real live fish. It was so nice that the New York Herald printed stories about it, and the New York Times called it the most novel, if not the most successful enterprise that New York has seen for many a day. But wait a second, awesome is what you're thinking, I know. How could a subway have been built and even run? This thing actually ran successfully. So how could this have been built and been built with such impressive craftsmanship and even gotten so much attention, not just from passengers, and by the way, hundreds of thousands of people paid to see and ride it, but it not only got attention from them, from the passengers, but it also got attention from the media. This thing was actually famous. So given all that, how is it that decades later it's buried and forgotten and nobody knew anything about it? That's a very good question, and here's the story behind the secret subway. It all started with this guy, Alfred E Beach. Beach was a real genius, and you know that's important to remember while we talk about him, that Beach really was a genius. It's an important part of his story when you see how it turned out. He really was a genius. And what the heck do I mean by genius? Here's what I mean. Beach designed the main parts of a typewriter that are still used today. He started one of the nation's first schools for freed slaves, the Beach Institute, and today it's deemed as a socially and historically significant museum site. He also built one of the most successful and brainy magazines ever. It's still around today, the Scientific American. He also had a business with very, very famous clients who paid him for his help and guidance. His clients were people like Samuel Morse, Alexander Graham Bell, and Thomas Edison. Holy moly, those guys paid Beach to learn from him. You get the idea? This guy was a genius. This guy was like the Awesome Mayo of his time. I guess I could have just said that. And there's one other thing that he did, and we're going to talk about it right now. So Beach saw all the traffic congestion in New York, and he thought that there must be a better way for people to travel, a better way for people to commute. So he came up with an idea of using a giant tube underground, and the giant tube would be powered by a giant fan. And when the fan went in one direction, it would push the tube, and when the fan went in the opposite direction, it would pull the tube back, the way that you would push and pull liquid through a straw. So that was his idea. And this was way back in the 1860s, right after the American Civil War. Remember, when the construction workers were building the subway, that was around 1910, but Beach's idea was way before that in the 1860s. This guy was brilliant. But there was one problem, a very, very big problem. The problem was this guy, William Boss Tweed. He was a corrupt politician who basically ran New York City. I know, an immoral politician in New York City? What? And he's actually kind of still a well-known guy. Here's Tweed's character in the Martin Scorsese movie, Gangs of New York. Now, Tweed was at the top of the chain. He was the big dog. He was the third largest landowner in all of New York City. He was rich, he was politically connected, and he was neck deep in schemes like bribery and money laundering, and he was even convicted of stealing over $2 billion in today's money from taxpayers. $2 billion. And he would eventually die in jail. But before that, Tweed was in power during Beach's time, so for anything to get done in New York City, it needed Tweed's approval. But Beach didn't want to pay Tweed any money. He didn't want to pay him any bribes. He didn't want to give him any credit. Beach thought of Tweed as a low-life thug, somebody that Beach didn't have to get permission or approval from. And Beach thought that his idea was so brilliant that he didn't need a moron like Tweed anyway. So Beach decided to dig under the city himself and secretly build his own subway. We've all been there, right? Now his idea was that he would build a subway that was so elegant and so well designed and so effective effective that everybody would come around and fall in love with the idea so much that the city would give him the money that he needed to do his subways and complete his subways all over the city. That was his idea. Once the public saw Beach's masterpiece, he was so certain that everybody, even William Tweed, would come around. So Beach spent over $50 million in today's money, and a few months later, in February of 1870, remember, this was way before the official subway of the 1910s. This was way back in 1870. That's when Beach opened his subway. He didn't just have the idea, that it was actually open and running by 1870. And everything went according to plan. Almost everything went according to plan. The public marveled, the media was in love, and it seemed like his vision was going to get the approval and the attention that he wanted. There was just one problem. How do you think Tweed reacted to the success of the subway? Did he admit public defeat and retire to his study to re-examine his flawed thinking? Here's a better way to think about it. You already know how the story ends, right? You know that decades later the subway would be found buried and forgotten, but now you know how much of a success it was. So think about that for a second. On one hand, we have the fact that it worked. This thing actually worked even though nobody thought it was possible. And think about this. This was half a century before the Model T, so their skepticism was understandable. But Beach actually got this thing to work. It was successful. It was ahead of its time. People loved it. It was beautiful. It was brilliant. So all this stuff is on one hand over here, right? So that was all on one hand, right? So you have to wonder, what was on the other hand? What was the counterweight to all of that was on the other end of the scale that outweighed and nullified all of the positives? What was it? What was over here? Think about it. You got it. Of course you got it. Everybody got it because everybody knew it was that mother grabber Tweed. Bam! Look what he did. He hated the subway and he looked at it as a personal insult. And he did everything in his power to shut it down and cause problems for Beach. And at the end of the day, it worked. Tweed used all his influence, all his power, all his connections to muck up the plans. If Beach got the permits, he didn't have the money. If he got the money, then he didn't have the permits. And in the end, because of the troubles that Tweed caused, Beach's idea was never completed. It was eventually buried and forgotten. And Tweed's media contacts helped him keep it forgotten, and the brilliant Alfred Beach died nearly broke. There are so many lessons to learn from Beach's brilliance, but what is probably the most important to note is his brilliance. This guy was a genius, and he was right. His idea worked, and it was executed with brilliant precision. And even for a city as cutting edge and as advanced as New York, the subway was generations ahead of its time. He was something of a Steve Jobs, not just with brilliance, but also with the design sense to make it usable and lovable. But even Alfred Beach type of brilliance was not enough. Steve Jobs type of brilliance was not enough. Mayo type of brilliance was not well, that probably would have been enough, but let's pretend that was not enough. The problem he had, his fatal oversight, was a single friendship that he failed to make. And by all accounts, William Tweed would have been easy to deal with. He had settled for just wanting to have a little credit, a little acknowledgement, but Beach dug in his heels, and so did Tweed. And this didn't just cost Beach or New York City, but it cost the entire subterranean movement decades of lost opportunity, and it buried the name of the pioneer, Alfred Beach. So that was a not ideal example. Let's move on to a more ideal example. The second story time. It starts with this guy. He was a professor, and he once raised the standards of his class so dramatically that students protested. They actually protested. But instead of being stonewalled about it, the professor worked with each one of them very deeply to raise their performance. This led to more skilled graduates, and the once bitter students developed respect for the professor and his methods. And he learned an important lesson from doing this, that he could change the hearts and minds of his critics by helping them achieve more. That's a sentence I want you to remember. And this was going to be an important lesson for the professor to remember, because through his work he discovered a startling and unpopular truth, and sharing his findings was going to create enemies. At the time, people thought that germs came from disease, but the professor found out that germs did not come from disease, but they caused disease. This idea would change so many long-held beliefs that resistance was expected, and many people, even in the scientific community, rejected the professor's idea and attacked his credibility. But the professor knew that the secret to getting the compliance that he wanted relied on his ability to work with his enemies, not against. He could have fought back or proved them wrong or publicly outwitted and humiliated them, but if he did that, he would only strengthen the resolve of his detractors. So instead, he went in the opposite direction. Using the same tactics with his students, the professor went out of his way and regularly gave credit to others and publicly honored his colleagues and predecessors. Instead of fighting with them, he would invite them to contribute, and even when his idea would prevail, he would still applaud others for their effort and intellect. For example, one day his assistant was supposed to inject a group of test chickens for a cholera experiment, but instead the assistant went on vacation. What the heck? When the assistant came back, he saw that instead of dying from cholera, the chickens were able to fully recover. This idea was nuts, that a small man-made exposure to a disease could cause the body to protect itself from the larger natural exposure. The professor not only gave his assistant credit for the idea, even though it was caused by his negligence and not his competence. But then on top of that, the professor called the resulting idea a vaccination. This was an honorary nod to the well-known scientist named Edward Jenner. Now, Jenner is the famous doctor who treated smallpox and is said to have saved more lives than any other single person in history, except for me, of course. He's still referenced today. In the show The Walking Dead, the character, Dr. Edwin Jenner, is a reference to Edward Jenner. Here's a picture of that character saving lives with the machine gun. Come on, Hollywood, what the F? The point is, Jenner is a big deal, and he still is a big deal. But Jenner was already famous at the time. In fact, he was so famous that many were jealous of the doctor, and a lot of people tried to invalidate his work and steal credit for his ideas. Now, the professor's work was advanced enough past Jenner's work that he didn't have to give Jenner credit. And this was a time when scientists were notorious for stealing work and taking credit for the sake of publicity. So the professor's decision, his choice to do the opposite and credit both his assistant, and think about that, how many people credit their assistants, but he gave credit to his assistant, and he helped his assistant, Charles Chamberlain, become a well-known scientist on his own. He gave Charles credit, but then he also gave a huge credit to Jenner, and even used a name, vaccination, that we still use today, a name that he knew would be associated with Jenner. So to do all that, especially during this time of credit stealing and idea stealing, the professor's actions were very significant. Some would say stupid, but he did it anyway because he knew what he was doing. And also, another thing that the professor did here is he also made sure that he helped the progress of others by sending targeted portions of his work to targeted people who would benefit the most from it. One of these people who benefited immensely was a surgeon named Sir Joseph Lister. He was fascinated with the professor's research on germs, and based on the professor's work, Lister became the pioneer of sterilizing surgical instruments before surgery. Try saying that 10 times. And when people saw the difference that this stuff made, that this sanitizing made, the difference that this created in the immediate drop in surgical fatality rates, Lister permanently changed the medical world. And he became so synonymous with cleansing that way back in the 1870s, an antiseptic mouthwash was named after him. Listerine. Ba-bam! That's what I'm talking about. You see what he was doing? You see what the professor was doing? Do you see the difference? The difference in his approach is obvious, right? Think of how Beach treated Tweed, right? Look at that on one hand. Then look at the professor. Look how he treated his enemies or his potential enemies or people that could have been threats or actually were threats. How did he deal with them? Look at how he dealt with the protesting students. Look at how he dealt with his assistant Charles in charge, or Machine Gun Jenner, or Lamb Chops Lister. And because of his approach, he was able to father an entire area of life-saving medical practices. He was able to do this because he became the rising tide that raised the ships around him. Instead of attacking others and the work of others, he helped to advance them. By raising their performance, he was able to turn enemies and critics, and even potential enemies and critics, into allies. It was by doing this that he was able to turn all the resistance that his idea was getting, he turned that resistance into eventual acceptance, which would have happened anyway. Just like with the subway, the ideas would eventually be accepted because both the professor and Beach were right. But with the professor's approach, he was able to collapse the timeline and make acceptance happen much faster. This is a much different approach than Beach. And it doesn't take as much effort as you might think. You'll often be surprised at how easy it is to win people over, and the cost of not doing so will often outweigh the price your ego may have to pay in order to do it correctly. Here's a student example. Roger Meldley's been a student of ours for a while. He worked at a real estate brokerage. He wasn't broke, but he wasn't much better. Now, he used something called the MFM, the manufacturer franchise model, and he used a very small part of that model, and he talked to a very successful $1 million plus producing real estate agent to find out exactly what that agent was doing and what brilliance that Roger could borrow. With permission, by the way. When this is done correctly, people will openly share their secrets and help you implement them. So Roger found out that the big secret from this agent was a mailing piece that the agent was using, and he also found out that what the criteria was that the agent was using to get his mailing list that he sent this piece to. So with those two things, the mailing piece that the agent gave him and the mailing list criteria that he also got from the agent, now Roger had enough to get started. That all makes sense, right? Roger got the piece to send and the instructions on who to send it to. And even though, by the way, even though I'm glossing over this, this is a brilliantly powerful concept, and anybody can do this, and it's a real simple way to make a killing. Anyway, Roger got what he needed, and it was going to be a great success, but there was a problem. He had to get permission from his broker, and that was going to be a problem. Anytime this idea came up, anytime he brought up the idea, the broker would always find flaws in the idea. The broker found, some excuse to invalidate the idea. Things like differences in market demographics, pricing variations, legal issues, or some other reason to downplay the potential effectiveness or the potential profitability of Roger's idea. Now, at first, he was determined to prove his broker wrong, so he'd find counter-arguments to every point that his broker brought up, or he'd try to get the support of other agents and try to pressure the broker into compliance. Or he'd engage in these detailed explanations with his broker and try to explain to the broker why the broker's conclusions were wrong. What was he doing? This should be obvious, right? He was creating a Tweed. He was giving his enemy more conviction. This went on for weeks and then months and then over a year with the same result. No results, basically. But because Roger was a good student and he wanted to improve, he talked to the always brilliant Sonny and he learned from his mistake. And then he appreciated the situation situation for what it was, an enemy that needed to be destroyed with friendship. So after a minor adjustment in his approach, he had a 5-minute game-changing conversation with his broker about ideas on how to grow the business. And at the end of that conversation, Roger walked out of the office with a plan that the broker was excited about, a plan that the broker appreciated the brilliance of, and a plan that the broker would require that his best agents at the office begin implementing immediately. This idea that the broker loved was the exact same idea that Roger had to begin with. That's the power of today's lesson. That's the power of creating a friendship and allowing your brilliance to come through somebody else's words so convincingly that they think the brilliance is theirs. Everybody wants ownership of brilliance. And yes, you should play a drinking game with the word brilliance. It's what everybody wants. Even if it means that they just get to put their name on a winning idea. Perception is reality. If they feel smarter, then they are smarter. And this is a skill that anybody can develop. After a little bit of practice, Roger did it in less than 5 minutes. And don't get me wrong, this does take practice. The dialogue, the pacing, the tonality, it's all important. But once you get it down, it'll be easy peasy. It's a nightmare to get there, but just like anything, once you get it, you'll get it. Now, after Roger had the cooperation and not competition of his brokers, some of the best agents at the brokerage paid for the campaigns to be carried out. And then they paid Roger based on the deals that they closed. In less than 45 days, Roger's net income was over $2,500 a week. That's how a real estate agent went from zero to an extra 10 grand a month without talking to a single buyer or seller or even going to a single closing, all from a 5-minute conversation. And Roger's actually doubled his income with his broker's help. The broker's actually become one of his biggest cheerleaders. That's what happens when you destroy enemies the right way. Remember, the best way to have people invested in the execution of an idea is to have them invested in the creation of the idea. The most permanent way to destroy an enemy is to turn them into an ally. And think about this. It went on for over a year. At 10 grand a month, that 5-minute conversation and the delaying of that 5-minute conversation cost him at least $120,000. That's the cost of being thick-headed. That's the cost of being untrained. Destroying enemies with friendship. And this was all echoed from our 2 examples earlier, right? Beach fought his enemy tooth and nail only to have him multiply in strength and numbers. And although his brilliant idea of a subway was generations ahead of its time, his brilliance was buried, literally buried and forgotten, and he died nearly penniless. On the other hand, the professor made sure that he created or aligned himself with the greatest minds of his time. He knew that mental acceptance of his groundbreaking ideas would only come from mental investment. Instead of fighting his resistance, he used the momentum to shape the energy in a better direction. This is also why he created an institute to gather specialists of all kinds to share brilliance. Today, there are over 30 of these institutes in over 25 countries. And today, the professor is legendary, a father of immunology, and directly and indirectly responsible for saving the lives of hundreds of millions of people, maybe billions. Remember, Edward Jenner is considered to be the man who saved more lives than anybody else. Well, the professor might be number 2 or number 3, whatever number he is, he's up there, and his work has saved more lives today. Even today, more lives are saved because of his work than almost any other person to have ever lived. His name in America is often associated with milk, but his work went way past that. His name was Louis Pasteur, and that's the story of how the father of immunology changed the world. Statistically, at least 2 to 3 people in your family would be dead if it wasn't for his work. So keep that in mind. And finally, remember this: whenever anything stops growing, that is the exact moment that it starts dying. If you're not getting better, you're getting worse. Staying where you are is always easier than getting to where you want to be, but if you don't get where you want to be, then you're going to belong where you are. Don't settle. If you're a good fit, then you should apply to become a builder. Get personally trained to do unbelievable things. Together, we can build empires. WeBuildEmpires.com. As always, thank you so much for everything. Until next time, God bless.